Welcome to the second lecture for International Regulatory Frameworks for Climate Change and Environmental Management. So in this lecture we're looking at the United Nations Charter and International Whaling Convention. So the first substantive lecture in our course. We're starting, as we explained in the introduction, we're starting with the major treaties agreed after World War II, or with the UN Charter slightly before World War II ended, but starting with 1945 and then working through all of the major treaties since then. So I'm going to use these lectures particularly to explain some of the fundamental issues that we're dealing with in all other conventions. So we'll look at things like sovereignty and the like. Okay, so I'll start with the context, the history, and I'm going to break up the lectures and the groups into four groups, 1945 to 1960. And then later lectures will be in the sort of 1960 to 1980, 1980 to 1990, and 1990 to the present. And those are artificial groups in a way. I've created them. They're not something you'll find in a modern history book. But I want to use them particularly for us thinking about international environmental regulation, because what we'll find is in this early period of 1945 to 1960, there's very little action in terms of of environmental protection. It's only when you get to the 70s that you start to see things like the World Heritage Convention, the Ramsar Convention, all these major treaties being agreed in the early 1970s, and then progressively since then. So why is a big part of understanding, the overall context and history. So after context, we'll look at the United Nations Charter, really just to understand the overall international framework. And then I'm going to look at the Whaling Convention, recent whaling, role of politics and the like. And again, why I'm wanting to focus on the Whaling Convention is not that it's a particularly important convention. Okay, yes, it's important if you're a whale. But in terms of, in comparison to climate change or the overall biodiversity convention or something like that, why focus on whaling? I want to do it because it's an early convention. It's quite simple. And we'll look at the whole convention. And I really want to tease it apart to understand things like sovereignty, how a convention is created, how it's administered. So it's about fundamental concepts more than the content of the Whaling Convention. Just before we jump into that preliminary topic, in terms of notes, I don't want to fill your... I really think that, particularly in a lot of university courses, people try and jam all this detail into your head that you forget really quickly. That was my experience anyway. When I was an undergraduate and I did a science and law degree, I kept all my notes and they filled this massive box. And I moved quite a lot when I finished university, and every time I moved, I had this massive box that I would lug around to the next flat. And after I think it was a year or two, I thought, I can't keep moving these huge box of notes. But I didn't want to, here was 6 years of my life. I didn't just want to throw them in the bin. So I thought, I'll go through each one of them and I will just summarize down to one page all of my courses. And then I'll bind them and I'll have this little book that I'll take around with me. So rather than the entire box, so I'll just boil everything down. And I opened the box and it pulled out, big wads of paper, which were my notes. And I'd look at them, and there was some vague similarity to my writing, but for many courses, beyond some vague appearance to my handwriting, I had no recollection at all of even having done the course. Could not remember a thing about it. Not one thing. It looked like it had been, written by someone else, except it was in my handwriting. And having thought about that, and now you guys are a lot smarter than me, I'm sure that you're like a sponge that just soaks up all this detail and remembers it forever. But at least for me, it was a really big lesson in terms of detail. And so I don't want to fill your heads with detail. I want to tell you a story, and I want you to remember the overall characters and the plot development, but the details of the conventions aren't particularly important. Where the overall story is hopefully helpful is in, let's just say, fast forward 10 years, and you're working as a planner, say, for a local government, or in some sphere in government or for a company or the like, and issue comes up about a wetland that's in some activity is going to affect, and there's issues about it, and you might remember, oh yeah, I remember that there's something about international migratory birds or something from that course I did years ago. Is it Ramsar? Yeah, Ramsar. And you can do a Google on Ramsar and you'll find the website and you can find huge information about it really quickly. As long as you've got that hook in your mind about the overall things, you can easily find them. But if you don't even recognise there's an issue, that's when you're just sort of blinded to it. So what I want you to leave the course with is an overall understanding, but not buried in detail. Okay, in that context, I've already told you that you've got this question on your exam. You've only got half an hour to do it, but you can take in notes, 2 pages of notes. But in terms of taking notes in lectures, don't get hung up on taking a lot of detail. If you're understanding the overall picture and you could summarise each lecture in a paragraph, that's enough in terms of assessment for this course. And that's really all I want you to take away. Does that sound okay? And fair enough? Fair? Okay. Let's then jump into the context and then the UN Charter and the Whaling Convention, understanding that what we're really looking at these two conventions for is fundamental concepts. Okay, in terms of context, breaking this up into, as I said, the first period of 1945 to 1960. And this is obviously a period of post-World War II. So Europe had destroyed itself, large parts of the Pacific were destroyed, Middle East. 2 atomic bombs had just been dropped on Japan by the United States of America. So the context in terms of the history and politics of this period, can I summarise it just in a few key dot points? It's a period of post-World War II rebuilding. So the world had tried to, all the major governments had tried to destroy each other. It's a period of rapid industrial growth in the United States of America, Australia, Europe, and many parts of the world, driven by major technological advances. So a lot of technology came out of the war effort. New ropes, new nylons, new radar, new aeroplanes, all of this technology, which now could be applied to civilian uses. So there's this massive growth in manufacturing and the like. Government and public concern for the environment is relatively low. Few environmental treaties are negotiated during this period. When we look at the Whaling Convention, we'll actually see it's about the use of whales. It's about actually, seeing them as another fishery rather than conserving them. And there's also the Chinese Revolution in 1946 to 1950, and the Cold War between the US and Russia commences. There's the threat of nuclear war during this period was a dominant international concern. And I mentioned in that first lecture that nuclear waste in the Marshall Islands, that dome of concrete, that is all the residue from the testing during the 1940s and 50s in the Pacific, which then is just basically put into that pile and now capped with concrete, but it's the legacy we've still got. So in the context of post-World War II rebuilding is the Charter of the United Nations. So signed in 1945 in San Francisco. You can easily get it on the internet. And we see its classic sort of structure of international agreements. They start with a preamble, the recitals, which explain the problem that the agreement is trying to solve. So the Charter of the United Nations. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetimes has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equality and the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, and for these ends. decided to come together and form this treaty. Okay, if you look at the treaty, it's not particularly long. You start with some purposes and the like. I'm just going to, sorry, can you read that Article 4? Sorry, Article 2, Paragraph 4. Can you read that? That I've circled in red? I'll just read it out. So all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other state or any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. So a prohibition on the use of armed force against other states. That was the fundamental driver for the formation of the United Nations. So everyone knows the United Nations symbol, so here's the United Nations flag. And the headquarters in New York. You can see the so that building there is the United Nations, and then the next picture I'm going to show you is the General Assembly, which is the building just to the right of it, much smaller. So this is inside that dome, which this is the, if you see pictures on the news about, the UN meeting in New York, it'll be in this General Assembly. And here's just another image of the General Assembly and a speaker. Now, the United Nations, so the basic things with the United Nations is every country gets one vote. So everyone here, these are all delegates of the countries. So does anyone know how many countries we've got at the moment? It changes over time. How many countries are there in the world? 200? No. No, not 300? 170? No. Somewhere in between 170 and 250. 197? Getting closer, a little bit lower? It depends how you count them, actually. Most people say that there's about 193 at the moment, but even that ignores things like, what are countries that ignores? If I said there's 193 countries in the world, what is one obvious country that gets ignored? Sorry? Palestine? Yeah, you could argue Palestine is a country. Probably not at the moment. It's an occupied. It's not self-governing. What's a country? Very close to, I'll give you a hint. It's very close to China. Taiwan. A large island off China, Taiwan. So, end of the Chinese Civil War, the government of China at the time was defeated and retreated to the island of Taiwan. And so mainland China was the victorious Communist Party. Since then, mainland China still claims Taiwan as a renegade province. Taiwan has a sort of similar view of mainland China, I suppose not as a renegade province, but until, does anyone know then the history? So the government that retreated to Taiwan, until the 1970s, that was recognised as internationally as the government of China, even though mainland China was controlled by the Communist Party. That wasn't recognised as the government of China. They actually recognised the government of Taiwan, which is there's the People's Republic of China is mainland China, and there's the Republic of China is Taiwan. So the Republic of China, Taiwan, had essentially the seat at the UN, and then, do you know what happened? People from China will know what happened. Who was it that led to the Taiwanese government being sort of not recognised? Famous United States president, infamous, resigned in disgrace, Richard Nixon. Basically moved US policy to recognising mainland China as the government of China, and Taiwan effectively got left out in the cold, even though it's very, without insulting people from anyone from China, but clearly Taiwan is a self-governing territory, is a government. It's got every criteria for a country, but no one no one recognises it as a country. Even Australia, we trade a lot with Taiwan. We don't recognise it as a country. Because of why? Because of the power of mainland China. Because mainland China gets very, very angry with anyone even thinking of recognising Taiwan. It's just like a heresy. So I was actually reading a news report just a month or so ago. It was one of those sort of random ones that I haven't really seen a lot of, but it was a military writer in the US saying the South China Sea isn't the likely flashpoint for military conflict. Taiwan and mainland China are still the most likely major conflict in that region is still Taiwan and mainland China, because mainland China's army is still built around essentially invading Taiwan and the ability to do so. And then the US supports Taiwan and has said that they will protect it, so that there's that holds mainland China off invading Taiwan, but it is still a massive issue. But Taiwan is not recognised as a country and doesn't have a seat in the UN. So in the 193, we don't include Taiwan. But of the 193 countries that have a seat, and the Vatican as well isn't, so there's some odd ones that don't have a seat. But in the General Assembly, everyone gets one vote. But the key thing is, big countries like mainland China and the US and Russia and France and Germany, which have massive, economic might, they all only get one vote. But what's the key thing with the General Assembly? Can it make a resolution, put it this way, is a resolution of the General Assembly binding on any member? No. The key thing is the 193 countries can vote, and let's just say it's a vote to condemn Israel, which has commonly been done. So lots of countries, wanting to condemn Israel for what it's done in Palestine, and a number of countries vote against it, so the US. But let's just say it's a vote of 170 versus 23. The 170 voting to condemn Israel for what it's done in Palestine is not binding on Israel, and Israel will say, this is you're anti-Jewish people, and we refuse to recognise it. And there's no legally binding effect of a resolution of the General Assembly. The major body, though, that can have binding effect is this, so the Security Council. So you've got the UN General Assembly, which has non-binding resolutions. Within the UN structure, though, the Security Council is arguably the most important limb of the UN. So it's made up of what? Does anyone know who's on the Security Council? So there's a number of permanent members. So who are they? So how many are there?
5.
5? And how many non-permanent members? No? It's not 2. Pretty sure it's 15 at the moment. I can't remember myself, actually. I should know that. They're non-permanent. They come and go. But the 5 permanent members are the really important ones. Who are they? 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The United States of America, let's mark them off. And you can think of it this way. Who are all the countries that won World War II, if you call it winning? Because basically they got to write the rule book.
UK.
The United Kingdom, yep, that's 2. France is 3. Russia is 4. China. They're the 5 permanent members. So you don't have Germany, even though it's a massive, or Japan, because even though they have massive economies, they didn't win World War II. They didn't get to write the rules. So the 5 permanent members basically wrote, the charter, and they wrote themselves into a position of huge power because the 5 permanent members on the Security Council can veto any resolution, which means that even if everyone on the Security Council votes in favour of a resolution, if one of the 5 permanent members votes against it, the resolution is lost. So there can be no resolution without effectively the unanimous support of the 5 permanent members, and they often fight. So particularly during the Cold War, Russia and the US, there's basically very few resolutions, like even, like the war in Vietnam and associated, there's very few resolutions related to those things. So the Security Council is concerned with international peace and security. I'm sorry, I should have said that to start with. So the General Assembly can consider anything, but the Security Council is there to protect international peace and security. And the key thing is its resolutions can authorise the use of armed force. So countries can use armed force against another country only in 2 situations. One is self-defence, which is quite limited and has to be proportional to the threat that you're facing. So for instance, if Israel is about to be attacked by another country dropping bombs in it, Israeli jets could go and blow up those bombs. And that would be a legitimate use of armed force, but Israel couldn't nuke the other country because it would be completely disproportionate to the threat. So there's proportionality in use of self-defence, and it's quite limited. It's not, there was the Bush doctrine of preemptive self-defence, where even though the threat hasn't crystallised, you can still go in and attack because they're going to do it sometime in the future. Self-defence is meant to be in response to an immediate threat. So that's quite limited, and that's built into the UN Charter, self-defence. And the other one is if it's authorised by the Security Council. So the Security Council authorised, for instance, the attacks against Libya and the like. There was a lot of debate with the Second Iraq War, whether it was authorised. Unless you're a US policy person, you would say it wasn't authorised. The US and Australia claimed that it was authorised by this earlier UN resolution, but pretty well it wasn't. So the Second Iraq War wasn't in self-defence, it wasn't authorised, it was illegal under international law. But the US, having the biggest military, could do it, or did it rather. So the Security Council has immense power, but the power is constrained by the 5 permanent members. So there'll never be a resolution, for instance, against China for basically its annexation of islands in the South China Sea, because China just will veto that. So that's the Security Council, really important limb of the UN. And, talking about peace and security in environmental protection, war is really bad for the environment as well as people. So peace and security is a component of, not something that we focus on beyond this, but the Security Council is a really important component of the international order. Our current Secretary General, originally from Portugal, Portuguese diplomat, Antonio Guterres, was elected last year. So the previous Secretary General had been there for 2 terms, and he's our current Secretary General. So essentially a very important figurehead, responsible for overall administration, but it's the countries themselves that essentially get the votes. This looks like a spaghetti, but I just put it up because the UN is a very complex administrative body. There's a whole range of programs that you know of. So the United Nations UNDP, United Nations Development Program, UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, etc. A whole range of them. The Security Council. So there's a General Assembly, the Security Council. They're the 2 big ones to be aware of. There's a Secretariat as well. But the key thing to emphasise with the UN system is the General Assembly doesn't make binding resolutions. So it's not a government that can impose order on other countries. The only component of the UN system that can impose a binding resolution is the Security Council, and it's really limited to threats to international or regional peace and security. And it can be vetoed by the 5 permanent members as well, so there's a whole heap of limitations on it. UN has a number of regional groups, so 5 UN regional groups are used to distribute membership quotas in UN bodies and leadership positions. I'll mention negotiating voting blocks exist a little bit later, the G77. So here's the 5 UN regional groups. So for instance, if you're applying for a job, for instance, and you're from Africa, or you'll be in that group, and they try and basically distribute the jobs evenly so that there is, there are quotas from different regions. I would just mention there's this great program at the UNEP in New York where you can go if you're enrolled in any master's program around the world, you can go or apply to it's an unpaid 3-month internship at the UNEP. The girl who's second from the left was a student here in this course in 2013, Dilva. She was lovely Italian, she's one of those people who speaks Italian, French, English, a whole heap of languages, and she came to see me in her office, in my office, before going on this program, and said, "Oh, Chris, I took your advice and I applied for the program and they accepted me, but my parents don't want me to go, and they're not, going to, she was over from Italy and I can't afford to go." And I said, "Dilva, are you crazy? Go. Rent your unit." Anyway, she went and she survived. Okay, it's always terrible when you give advice to someone and they follow your advice and then it all turns bad, but it all turned out really well. So she went and did the 3-month program, and you guys could, but it is unpaid, so you have to, meet airfares there, as well as when you live there. But often a lot of the interns rent together, so you don't. I think she rented with, or took a couch on one of the other interns. Had rented, in a unit of another intern. And there's a couple of other interns there, and then a couple of the managers. So there's also a range of other things that you might get involved in. So for Australian students, there's Global Voices, which offers opportunities for Australian students to meet to go to international meetings. And again, a student from this course a few years ago was involved in that. So that could be something if you want to go to an international meeting. Check out Global Voices. Obviously, folk from other countries, there's probably a range of other programs that your governments might run. So, okay, emphasise with the UN, there's no international unilateral government as such. International law is founded on the sovereignty of individual nations, and I'll talk more about sovereignty when we talk about whaling, but essentially, sovereignty, it's a bit of a nebulous concept, but it's essentially the recognition of the ability of a government to control a particular geographic area. So the Australian government has sovereignty over the country that we're in, Australia, and including this classroom. So the Australian government can make laws, and within our Australian government, obviously we've got federal, state and local government, but within our system of government we can make laws to regulate activities within this area. So for instance, it's state laws here that make it unlawful to murder someone or steal something. So the government of China, for instance, couldn't generally make a law making it unlawful to steal something in this room here in Brisbane, because it's not part of the area that the government of China controls. Countries can make laws related to their citizens even when they're outside the country, but there's got to be generally some link. So Australian law, for instance, just as an aside, makes it unlawful for an Australian citizen to kill a whale anywhere in the world. So if you're an Australian citizen, don't run off and just bludgeon to death a whale. It's a poor attempt at a joke. No one's going to be killing whales, I'm sure. But our laws make it unlawful for us as Australian citizens to kill whales anywhere in the world. So you can have laws that apply outside a country, but there has to be some link to the country generally. So sovereignty is that recognition of the ability to control that area. So the Australian government can control this and the like. So the UN does not have a general power to impose obligations on countries without their consent. That's with the limited exceptions of maintaining international peace. So the UN cannot impose international environmental obligations on individual countries such as China or the United States of America without their consent. So that's really important. Now, international environmental regulation and general international law and politics are intertwined with ongoing territorial disputes. So you talk about sovereignty, the recognition to control an area. Well, there's territorial disputes about many parts of the world, including the South China Sea. Disputes we'll look at, particularly when we look at the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea tomorrow. Disputes about islands between Japan and China, and yet a range of atolls south of China and the South China Sea. And those disputes are typically not just about power and government, they're actually about access to resources, so fisheries, oil and gas. Because if you can control an area, then you can extract the resources from it. So, just as an example, the Senkaku Islands, they're called Senkaku from Japan's perspective, but they're claimed by mainland China, Taiwan and Japan. You can see where they're located, quite close to Taiwan, but Japan had control of them from about 1890 to 1945, and then when Japan was militarily very strong, and then in the peace treaty between the United States of America and Japan, the islands were recognised as being Japanese territory, but mainland China and Taiwan refused to recognise that and claimed the islands as theirs. And this is a Japanese patrol vessel patrolling it. And if you go onto the internet and just do a search for the islands, you'll see all of these YouTube clips about clashes between Japanese patrol vessels and Chinese fishing vessels going in, essentially trying to assert control. They're essentially these rocky outcrops, so it's not the islands themselves that they're interested in, but as we'll learn about in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, if you control a habitable island, or an island as such under the Law of the Sea Convention, it gives you a maritime zone of 200 nautical miles around it. So you can control oil and gas extraction within that area. So having control of an island is really, really valuable, not for the island. So as I say, you could go onto YouTube, do a search for Senkaku or China-Japan territorial dispute. You get all of these YouTube clips. This was just a screen grab from a few years ago, where it was a news item about possible war over islands in the South China Sea. It really gets very heated, and you see when this flares up, you'll see protests in China and protests in Japan, where Japan and China have a lot of history of aggression between each other and a lot of cultural baggage. So a lot of ongoing angst between their societies. So there's a big domestic pressure in China to assert its control over these islands, and a big pressure in Japan to do the same. And it is to the point where there could be armed conflict between the two countries over them. Just a note side note on use of armed force. So this is Article 51. Basically says you can use armed force for self-defence or authorised under by the Security Council. So self-defence is quite limited. It's meant to be immediate and proportional. What about US drone strikes? So the US, it's killed thousands of, they call them targeted killings, they don't call them assassinations, but let's just call it what it is. They're assassinations of a whole range of people. Someone travelling in a car in Yemen, and suddenly a missile comes from a US drone and blows it up. So it's not in US territory, it's in a foreign country from a US perspective, and they're killing people. Is that lawful?
Is the US claiming self-defence?
Well, the US will say that they were terrorists, but under the normal traditional view of self-defence, you can't have preemptive. It has to be proportionate and immediate to an immediate threat. So if someone's about to, launch an artillery attack against you, you can blow up those weapons. But someone driving in a car in the back streets of Yemen, and they're suddenly blown up, doesn't meet the traditional requirements for self-defence. It's not authorised by a Security Council. Is it lawful? Simple answer is it's not. It's unlawful under the UN Charter, but US does it a lot. How do they get away with it?
Does the sovereign government have to have something to say about it?
Yemen complains, like they blow up, people in Pakistan and the hills of Pakistan. Pakistan goes nuts. So the sovereign governments complain about it, but how do they get away with it?
They spent like $40 billion on their military. And
They've got the biggest military in the world. Yep.
Well, they're a member of the Security Council, so unless they agree to take, action against themselves, then who's going to stop them? Really?
But yeah, that's a good point. But there's no Security Council resolution authorising it. But to be authorised, you've either got to have a Security Council resolution, which they don't have, or it has to be in self-defence. If you don't have one of those two, then it's unlawful. So they've got a right of veto in the Security Council, but they don't have a right to get a resolution because other countries can veto it or vote against it.
Well, I mean more to the response of their actions rather than
Yep.
them having a resolution.
Other countries could, complain about it, and there could be a UN resolution against them. But even without a UN resolution against them, what they're doing is unlawful. But yeah, they've got the biggest military in the world by a country mile, and effectively, yeah, they do it. Just think about that though, like they obviously don't do it in Australia. Australia is an ally to the US, but can you imagine the feeling of the Australian people if someone driving out the back of Toowoomba, a US drone came and blew them up, and the US claimed that they were terrorists? Can you imagine how you would feel as a country if the US did that to you? Particularly when you see the instances where, people at a wedding are blown up and there's, 50 people killed and children, and everyone says it was just a wedding, and the US says, oh, they were terrorists. It's pretty, you can see the amount of angst it would cause. If it happened here, it would be outrageous, but because it's not happening in our country, we, acquiesce to it. Anyway, that's an aside. The UN system, can I just pause? So the UN system, really important to understand the overall context. And you'll see on the exam at the end of the course, there'll invariably be some question about the UN system. So it's really important to understand that the UN can't make binding resolutions. Security Council role is not so important for us, but valuable context, but it can't make binding resolutions. So there's no binding international government. How we get international law and international environmental regulation is from two main sources. Does anyone know what they are? So the major source are agreements. So countries agree to something. So they can be called conventions, treaties, international agreements. Treaties, conventions used interchangeably. If you agree, then you're bound by it effectively. And then the other, much smaller source is customary international law, which is the rules that countries act in compliance with on the basis of being bound, even though there's not an agreement specifically in relation to them. So customary international law, relatively little for related to environment, but the big one I've already mentioned is sovereignty. So sovereignty is a concept that comes from customary international law. So countries over centuries have recognised, based on individual kingdoms, okay, one king would say, okay, this is my territory, another king would say, this is my territory, and they would rule within those realms. And sometimes they would go to war and fight over, bits in the... But as long as there were two kingdoms, those kings could rule within their territories. And so now we've got the modern equivalent as a country. They can rule within their territories. And so they can have agreements about certain things. And if they agree, then they're bound by it. But each is autonomous, apart, in its own sphere. So sovereignty is that concept of basically the idea of different kingdoms being able to control their own area. And countries generally act on the basis that they are bound by those principles of sovereignty. It comes from customary international law. It underpins our whole system of international government. It's a really important concept, but it's not in a treaty. But most of our international environmental agreements are in treaties. Okay, so let's look at the International Whaling Convention, the first treaty. And I'm going to hand out I'm actually just handing you out a copy of the International Whaling Convention. And I won't do this for any other treaty, but this is a nice, really short one, and it allows us to see an entire treaty and all of the major components. And for people listening on the Blackboard site, you can get it in the handout section. So it's just 4 pages. And I'll come back to it. So let's make a case study of it. Okay, so what I want to do is focus on whaling around Antarctica. So Antarctica, if we look down, on Google Earth, if you look down at Antarctica from above, you could see this image. Okay, and the next map is taken from the same perspective. Okay, so see on the left of that image, there's South America, and in the bottom right, there's Australia, and then obviously on the top, that would be Africa, the bottom of Africa. So that's just an orientation of Antarctica that's often used. So this is your classic map of Antarctica. So Australia you see in the bottom right-hand corner, in New Zealand. There's South America on the left. So if I just go back, so there's Google Earth. I've just taken the same orientation. Now Antarctica has a number of claims of sovereignty. So that might surprise you. But it does. It's got about 6 countries that claim sovereignty over Antarctica. You might think, Antarctica, that's not a country. Countries claim sovereignty over its territory though. So Australia's claim is, you can see it here. It's actually in 2 parts. Sorry, I should just gone over the French claim there. There's a little sliver, and then there's the Australian claim as well. Whoops, not very well done there. Here's the New Zealand claim. There's the Norwegian one, which has got a wavy line. And then there's 3 overlapping claims south of South America. One is the Argentinian claim, one is the Chilean claim, and one is the United Kingdom's claim. So obviously they're in dispute. And then there's this big chunk that's not claimed by any country. And yeah, so those countries claim it. Now, you typically see a map of the world. You might think a map of the world is a map of the world, but actually they're political statements often. So this is your typical map of the world. It shows Antarctica as white. Antarctica, it's a continent, but it doesn't belong to anyone, is the implication. So here we've got all the countries of the world, Antarctica white. Why do you think Antarctica is white? apart from being ice. Right?
Because there's no one country that has a legitimate claim or recognised claim on it?
Yeah, that's getting close.
Doesn't have a government.
Doesn't have a government? Well, if a country claims it is its territory, then it does have a government.
Because it belongs to the humanity or something like that.
That belongs to humanity. You could think that, but nowhere else in the world does land. Like Antarctica is a continent. It's covered in a mile of ice, but it is land. So it's not like the Arctic, which is floating ice. It is land. And then countries like, if you think about, well, what about Greenland? It's a big island covered in a lot of ice that very few people live on. How can it be part of a country? Why, if Greenland can be claimed by a country when it's mostly bloody ice, big glaciers, and uninhabited, if Greenland can be part of a country, why can't Antarctica?
Yeah, I think there's a convention which everyone just agreed that you can make these claims, but you can't actually do anything with it. So,
fantastic point. We're going to come to the Antarctic Treaty after lunch when we talk about Antarctic Treaty. There is an Antarctic Treaty, an agreement, but and it does basically. There's some deliberate ambiguity in it where the claims are not recognised, but they're also not abandoned. But why can't we agree? So this map, I was going to answer my question from before. Why is it white? It's white because it's probably a United States map. So the US doesn't have a claim of territory in Antarctica. It came late to the party. All of the original claimants, most of the territory was claimed by the United Kingdom when its explorers, Captain Cook was one of the earliest explorers of a lot of Antarctica, and they went along and claimed it as uninhabited land, terra nullius. They could claim it and they claimed sovereignty in it. And under normal principles of international law, you can claim sovereignty in Antarctica. It's just that countries don't recognise it because they want to maintain the ability to utilise the resources in the future. So Australia had inherited its claim from the UK in about the 1930s. And if you just applied the principles of sovereignty, you don't need a lot of settlement. You just need to have effective occupation of the land. Australia's got a number of bases. We've promulgated laws. We're engaged in effective occupation. If Greenland can be territory of a country, then Antarctica can be. But countries don't recognise it. China doesn't recognise it. Russia doesn't recognise it. The US, because they came late to the Antarctic party, so to speak, and they've all got bases there, and they refuse to recognise claims of other countries. And basically, most countries that claim territory there, it's very difficult to even survive in Antarctica. So most countries haven't pushed their claims of territory because there's no need to. They've just basically, it's all sitting there boiling away beneath the surface, but no one wants to bring it to the boil and have a fight over it. So a map like this is actually a political statement. Antarctica has a number of claims. Most countries don't recognise those claims though. So if you see, this is again a political statement. This is a map produced by the Australian government, Geoscience Australia, and it reflects Australia's claims of sovereignty. So you see, we'll talk about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea tomorrow, where countries can claim maritime zones. So all around mainland Australia, that sort of mustard area is Australia's 200 nautical mile EEZ. Around normal islands, like out here, Christmas Island and the like, you can claim a 200 nautical mile EEZ. So even though it's a small island, you get this massive area of fisheries. It's really valuable. And similarly down here around Macquarie Island, massive area. They get chopped, as we'll learn about in the Law of the Sea Convention, where you've got countries that are closer than 400 nautical miles apart. You normally split the difference and draw a line in the middle. That's why it comes in here. It's not like going out full 200 nautical miles. So see here, we're Papua New Guinea, up here in the Torres Strait. the Papua New Guinea and Australia are much closer than 400 nautical miles apart. So neither country can claim 200 nautical miles. So you split the difference. But down here around Antarctica, you see the little sliver here for France's claim. But then the rest of it, Australia has claimed a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, and Australia declared a whale sanctuary in that area. And wouldn't surprise you that in that area, under Australian law, you're not allowed to kill whales. Whale sanctuary, not allowed to kill whales. Get that. So here's Australia's Antarctic EEZ, exclusive economic zone. It's got 3 bases, Mawson, Davis and Casey. Within Australia's territory, there's also a number of Chinese bases just south of Davis, and there's Vostok, which is a Russian base. Does anyone know what Vostok is famous for? It's probably some brand of vodka or something, but it's famous for, because Vostok is a city in Russia as well. But what is the Vostok station famous for in climate change particularly? The Vostok ice cores. It's a place where some of the deepest ice cores have been taken, allowing essentially us to look back at hundreds of thousands of years of climate history have been taken at Vostok. Okay, I just point out Shackleton Ice Shelf. I'm going to show you a map in a moment. So you can see there that little line just at the end of the arrow. That's the edge of the Antarctic continent. And then there's a big tongue of a glacier that extends out over the sea. So there's a sort of glacier that extends out. So that's the Shackleton Ice Shelf. Another important point of context, there's a lot of different whale species. So everything from big blue whales down to small, the ones at the bottom are minke whales. So basically, we had the Whaling Convention in the 1946. There was an agreement essentially to try and conserve whales, but essentially Russia particularly and Japan massively overexploited and grossly underreported what they were taking, and whale stocks collapsed until in the early 1980s there was a worldwide ban on commercial whaling. So the big whales were the ones that had been basically taken out by the commercial whalers, and pretty well you didn't go after minkies if you're a commercial whaler because they're small. In comparison, why would you go after a minke when you can go after a blue whale? Having said they're small, if we had a minke whale in the room with us now, we'd be in a lot of trouble because it'd be bigger than the room. But they're relatively small. And there's arguments about the numbers. So blue whales, there's only, about 10,000 of them still. But minkies, can you see there, there's arguments about the total numbers, but there's well over 500,000 of them. And some whales have come back really strongly. So humpbacks are now well above 10,000. So when commercial whaling finished in the 1980s, Japan basically took its part of its whaling fleet and painted research on the side of the vessels and continued to basically carry out whaling but calling it research. So they were in the fleet, they send it down each Antarctic summer. They go down to Antarctica, or Southern Hemisphere summer, so Christmas time. So right now they'll be sailing down. And there's 3 catches, so those grey vessels along the top, you can see they've got a little front. They've got this high front, and on the front of that is a harpoon. So they go out and catch whales, and then they fire a harpoon. It's called an exploding head, cold grenade exploding head harpoon. I've got that wrong, but essentially it's got an explosive device in the front of it. It's supposed to hit the whale, explode, and basically mush up the insides of the whale so it kills it. And then if they don't kill it with the harpoon, they shoot it with a high-powered rifle once it's on the end of the harpoon, because often they kick about a lot and can take a while to die, which is one of the arguments about it being an inhumane way to kill them. So those 3 go out and catch them. Then they drag it back to the research ship, which is the Nishin Maru, the one in the middle. And then the ones down the bottom, there's those two white ones. You see they don't have a harpoon mounted on the front. They're the sighting vessels. They go out and find whales. And then there's a supply ship as well, because a lot of countries object to Japan, what Japan is whaling. They can't come into port in Australia. They can't come into port in New Zealand. So they have to basically leave Japan, sail around New Zealand, and spend a few months down in Antarctica, and then sail back. So they're resupplied by a ship called the Oceanic Bluebird, which is the one on the bottom right. And I think they've added in the last few years another effectively naval vessel to keep off the Sea Shepherd. And I think Sea Shepherd isn't going down this year to harass them. Anyway, locations of whaling, they present a report each year about where they've whaled. They present it to the International Whaling Commission as part of their effort to say that they're doing research. This is a map from the 2001-2002 report to the International Whaling Commission. It shows where they have killed minke whales. And so I was involved in a conservation group asked me a few years ago, we're getting all these reports because they would go to the Whaling Commission meetings. We've got all these reports which show them whaling in the Australian whale sanctuary. Can we take them to court? So I looked at it and said, well, yes, we can. We can take them to court in Australia. So what we did was we drew in, based on latitude and longitude, where the Australian whale sanctuary was, the EEZ, and then we just counted the number of dots within the report that the Japanese company that carried out the whaling had produced. We argued that those were admissions of something like 215 whales being killed within the Australian whale sanctuary. So we use that as evidence in a court case. We also got some eyewitness accounts. This one was from a Greenpeace fellow who, this picture was taken from a Greenpeace helicopter of a whale that had been killed. And we were able to locate exactly where it was by latitude and longitude, and that it was killed within the Australian Whale Sanctuary on the 16th of December 2001. So we had some pictures, we had their own reports, so we had evidence of killing in breach of Australian law. And here's that whale just before it's killed. So the Greenpeace helicopter was trying to fly and get between the vessel and the whale to try and, so they couldn't shoot it. But this picture was taken from the Greenpeace helicopter, and you can see the harpoon flying through the air. I've actually seen the footage, which I can no longer find online, of this. So they also had video footage running. And so they fired about 3 times at this. It was a mother. They found that out that it was lactating afterwards, so there would have been a baby that, when they killed it, died because it couldn't suckle its mother. So, and basically this whale is trying to get away. They fired this harpoon a number of times, and then in the video footage, this whale is in the water, and then there's no blood around it, and then suddenly it just, all this blood comes out. So it's obviously just had its lungs mashed up, and it just breathes out. And you can see the harpoon up on the deck of the vessel. So they tie it up to the side of the catching vessels, and they drag it back to the mothership, the factory vessel, where they chop it up. So here's some Greenpeace activists trying to interfere with them, and the Japanese spraying them with water. Then they drag it up the back, they transfer the whale to the factory vessel to be chopped up, and you can see here the fire hoses and the rope lines going down are meant to get in the way of the Greenpeace vessels, because the Greenpeace were trying to interfere with the transfer of the whale. You can see the sign there. Whales are not endangered, Greenpeace misleading the public. So that's the public relations effort from the whalers. And then here is a picture again from the Greenpeace helicopter. We're collecting tissue samples. And all I can say is that's a hell of a lot of tissue samples. So chopped up on the decks of the mothership. Okay, so that's context. How is this whaling in Antarctic waters regulated under international and national laws is the question. I see it's right on 1 o'clock. It won't take very long with this. Or Actually, do you want to take a break? Why don't we take a break? We've had this problem of, you've got in your minds, whales been killed in Antarctica. How is it regulated? Why don't we take say an hour for lunch and come back and does that sound good? So have a nice break, got emails and stuff to do. We'll take an hour, come back, and we will find out how whales are protected under international law. Hey, welcome back to Lecture 2, the International Regulatory Frameworks. We've just had a nice break. You'll recall that before the lecture we talked about the UN Charter and particularly emphasised the fact that there is no ability of the United Nations to, by majority resolution, impose rules upon any country. Each country has sovereignty within its own area or territory. So that's fundamental to understanding the overall international regime. An exception being the Security Council, but that's in relation to armed conflict and threats to international security. So in that background, the major way that countries take on international obligations is voluntarily by agreement through international conventions. And we've moved into the Whaling Convention, and we want to use that as a springboard to talk about these fundamental concepts and how they operate in practice and the difficulties with them, the agreement and also the implementation of those agreements. So we had just run through lots of pictures of whaling around Antarctica and talked a little bit about the different territorial claims over Antarctica. So gotten up to this point, which was the sources of international law controlling whaling and all other matters. So there's 4 sources of international law. This is from Article 38 of the International Court of Justice Statute. The first 2 are the most important by far. So the first one is where we get, apart from sovereignty, it's pretty well where we get everything related to international environmental regulation. So international conventions or treaties. And as I said, in English, conventions are used and treaties are just used interchangeably. They're international agreements. And then the second is international custom, which is more nebulous, but it's evidenced by general practice accepted as law. And the classic, most important international customary law that impacts on international environmental regulation is the principles around sovereignty, because that is then your springboard into controlling a territory and imposing your own domestic laws and also being bound in relation to your international agreements within your territory. The third and fourth there, general principles recognised by civilised nations and judicial decisions, they're very nebulous and relatively rarely used. The International Court of Justice can refer to them. For our purposes, it's the first 2 that you want to be aware of. Okay, so where can you find treaties, conventions? So the 2 general sources, you can go to, there's the treaty homepage for whatever treaty you're looking at. So as an example, the International Whaling Convention, I've given the website there. And those are rich sources of documents and details for the implementations of treaties, because what we'll see through the next few days when we look at all of these conventions is there's a huge amount of effort, not just in agreeing to a treaty, but in then implementing it and ongoing agreements. So you can find those documents on the treaty website. as a generic source, there is the United Nations Treaty Collection, which is a website for, those sorts of collections of treaties are very much things that were useful maybe a decade or two ago, before the internet really took over and you got all of these universally available sources. But back, say 30 years ago, prior to the internet, if you wanted to look at a treaty, it was difficult to get it, so there were collections of treaties. So the UN treaty collection is now just the online version of that, really not anywhere near as important as the actual treaty websites for, all the major treaties have really good websites. Okay, so as an example, the International Whaling Convention, it's the IWC homepage, so that's the International Whaling Commission, and you can go there, news and the like. They meet once a year, and in that context, I've given you a handout with this diagram on it, and this is one of the most useful things I can give you for helping you understand international environmental regulation. It was all summarised in this picture. I created because I couldn't find an image like this in any textbooks. So it's basically boiling down the process, the normal process for negotiating and then implementing a treaty. So you start on the left with negotiations commence and a text is proposed. And that is generated by countries recognising that there is a problem that they can't solve themselves within their country. So it might be something like, in a non-environmental sense, it might be international terrorism or international drug smuggling. So countries might agree on shared information about drug smuggling. Obviously, it's because it's international in nature, the countries can't solve it themselves, and there's a huge benefit in police forces sharing information. So that's a sort of situation where you've got an international problem that no country can solve by itself, and there is an obvious self-interest in cooperating with other countries. So they agree on how they will implement, or they agree on what they're going to do. So an international problem, they get together, they propose a text, and they negotiate about what their agreement will be. So just to use the drug analogy, for instance, one of the big problems, say, with Australia sharing information about drug smuggling is some countries, say Indonesia, have the death penalty, which Australia doesn't recognise and doesn't support. So sharing information about drug smuggling, knowing that in the country you're sharing the information with, the people might end up being put to death, raises all sorts of problems for Australia, the Australian police forces. So how you agree with another country, they might have a different system of law that you don't agree with, but there is a need also to cooperate. So having a formal agreement about what you do and how information might be used, that's just a non-environmental example. In an environmental sense, things like whaling. In international waters, many countries doing it. There's a shared interest in conserving, in not wiping out all whales so that no one has the resource in the future. That was the reason for the original convention. But international climate change, the epitome of an international problem that everyone is contributing to and no one country can solve, so we need to cooperate in some way. So how do we do that? So a formal agreement is how we go about trying to agree on our obligations. So negotiations commence, and then if you can agree on what your obligations will be, you agree on a text, then there's two stages. Signature, when the delegates negotiating the text of the treaty sign, but a country isn't bound at that stage. There's typically a next step, which is ratification, which is, it's actually, if you think about it a few hundred years ago, it's not such a problem now with instant communications, but if you think back, say, a couple hundred years, because this process has been around for centuries for international treaties, let's just say there's two kingdoms. In fact, let's make one, the United States wasn't a kingdom, but say they're negotiating with France about some trade deal between them, and it's back a couple of centuries ago after the United States has kicked the British Empire out, and the British Empire's retreated to Canada. So the United States government wants to negotiate a trade agreement with France. So they send a delegation of negotiators to France to agree on the text. And they give them certain instructions, but the details get worked out in France. And if you think about it from the government's perspective at that time, they'll be gone for months. There's no way to communicate. They can't, there's no phones, there's no, this is all, everything's going by ships. So the delegation is away for months, and then they come back and they give you what they've agreed. Now you as the government, you don't want to just give them a blank check and say, go and agree to anything. So typically, that ratification stage allows the delegation to come back, say, here's what we agreed to, and the government gets to look at it, the king or whoever, the government of the day gets to look at it and decide, yep, we're happy with what you've agreed. And then it's giving them an opportunity to make sure that what's been agreed is actually what the government is happy with. And then if they are happy, they then deposit what are traditionally called an instrument of ratification, which is a formal document from the government saying, we are ratifying this agreement. And so ratification is an essential stage typically, and still, even though we've got instant communications, we can send, we can email a document right now around the world to 1,000 people if we wanted to. This process starts centuries ago, and that's the context for understanding ratification. So it's still really important. And you hear about it a lot in, say, things like climate change, because famously, so different countries have different rules about ratification. So in some countries, the government, so in China, the government having signed something, the government can simply decide, and then it deposits its instruments of ratification. In the United States of America, though, they have a process where, because in their constitution they've tried to separate out power, the president of the day gets to, essentially as the executive government, they get to go and negotiate treaties. But before they can ratify it under the United States Constitution, it has to be approved by a 2/3 majority of the Senate. So 100 senators, a lot of them coming from really small states, so 2 from each state, isn't it? Yeah, so there's 50 odd states, 100 senators, a lot of them really small states, and very, very anti-international agreements. So for the last 30 years, the United States has had a huge problem with ratifying any international agreements. So Al Gore, when he was vice president, was instrumental in getting the world to agree to the Kyoto Protocol, to the Climate Change Convention in 1997. So he signed it on behalf of the executive government of the day. He took it back to the United States, and was it one vote? I think it was only one vote. We talk about it when we talk about Climate Change Convention, but he only got one vote in the Senate out of 100. So virtually no Democrats, no Republicans, everyone hated it, poured scorn on it. So the US was unable to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. The US also was instrumental. We'll talk tomorrow about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is this massively important international framework for the law of the sea and marine conservation and the like. The US was instrumental in negotiating it and still hasn't ratified it because the Senate refuses to approve it. So the US has never ratified UNCLOS. Virtually every other country in the world has ratified it. Similarly with the Kyoto Protocol, virtually every country in the world ratified it. Australia refused for about a decade under the cover of the US until we finally ratified it in 2007 when Kevin Rudd was elected. So signature and ratification are an important distinction. The US never ratified the Kyoto Protocol, and the difficulties of getting the US Senate to agree to any sort of climate change convention was one of the key reasons when we get to the Paris Agreement in 2015, there's basically this agreement that they wouldn't make it binding because the US would never be able to ratify it. Even though Obama would have wanted to, there was no way he was going to get a 2/3 majority in his Senate. That's the US system. Australia, for instance, has a different system. Our executive government doesn't need approval from our parliament. So the government of the day, they can sign, they can ratify. They typically lay it before parliament, but it's a voluntary thing. In our system, we don't have to, they don't have to do that. So signature ratification. So a number of people from other countries. If you don't know the ratification system in your country, I'd suggest you go and find out about it, because I think it's really interesting to know how your country deals with it. As I say, there's different frameworks in different countries for how the government gets approval, having signed a treaty, whether it can formally be bound by it. So ratification is that second stage. Once it's ratified, a country might still not be bound because different treaties set up different thresholds when the treaty will enter into force. And the reason for that is often with treaties where there's a shared, particularly where there's a shared trade issue, like say marine pollution and international shipping, countries that want to deal with international pollution and are going to impose regulation on vessels that are registered in their country, they don't want to sign up to something that's going to force or encourage ships to go to other countries to register to avoid their regulations. So often in treaties there will be some threshold of number of signatures, or in marine pollution it's been the percentage of the tonnage of registered vessels around the world that signatories or countries that have ratified the conventions are required to have ratified before it enters into force. So there can be different thresholds, and we'll see those in different treaties. So that's entry into force, and once it enters into force, the countries that have ratified it are bound by it. A country that signed it but not ratified it isn't bound by it. Again, UNCLOS is a good example. Australia and China, for instance, has ratified it, and so they're bound by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And just a couple of years ago, the Philippines took action against China over in a tribunal established under UNCLOS for a dispute about the South China Sea. So you're bound by it once you've ratified it and it's entered into force. But the US, as I said, still hasn't ratified UNCLOS. So that's entry into force. And then typically there's meetings of the parties to the convention where they get together and they discuss the implementation of the treaty and, ongoing cooperation. They report how they're doing. They share ideas. They, try and iron out any problems. And the typical term that they are called is a conference of the parties, or COPs. So in the United Nations Convention, the Climate Change Convention, they're up to COP 20, I think it's 23. So each year, they meet each year, but they can be called different things. So I want to look at that in terms of the Whaling Convention. So before I do that, can you just flag that sort of diagram? It's the sort of thing that might pop up in the exam. So here, a short answer question worth 3 marks. Explain the normal process for creating and administering international treaties. Use a diagram if it assists your explanation, but supplement it by explaining and writing the steps involved. Provide an example of a major international environmental treaty to illustrate your answer. So what we've just covered, again, I choose questions for the exam that really just test, do you understand fundamental concepts? And that process is really valuable to understand.
Good.
Yep.
Are the ramifications outlined in the treaty usually, and how are they administered?
The ramifications?
Or the binding...
The obligations?
Yeah.
Great question. Yes, they are. And we'll look at that in a moment with the Whaling Convention.
Okay.
Yep. And sometimes treaties are deliberately vague because they can't agree on a particular topic. We'll see that in a moment with Antarctica. There's deliberate ambiguity about sovereignty claims, and it was deliberate because they couldn't agree, but there were other things that they wanted to achieve. Okay, so a related question. Again, I've given you an example. I've given you a handout of how to... the major steps for interpreting a treaty. So you've got a handout. So, and on the back, it's got an extract from Articles 31 and 32 of the Vienna Convention. So the three main steps are, well, ensure you have the treaty in force at the time relevant to your problem and it's been ratified by your country. That's not normally a big issue, you know. If you're looking at climate change, they're well known, everyone's ratified them pretty well. And then what I'd suggest is you skim read the whole treaty and identify the parts relevant to your problem, and then interpret the parts of the treaty relevant to your problem in good faith in accordance with the ordinary meaning. Yep. That one's a three.
Don't want.
Oh, okay, yep. So, and the good faith, if you turn over the page and you see Article 31 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Article 31, paragraph 1 says, a treaty shall be interpreted in good faith in accordance with the ordinary meaning to be given to the terms of the treaty in their context and in light of its object and purpose. And can I just draw your attention to paragraph 3? There shall be taken into account, together with the context, A, any subsequent agreement between the parties regarding the interpretation of the treaty or the application of its provisions. So later agreements can be made. So in interpreting a treaty, you need to understand the treaty plus any later agreements, and that's why the websites are really useful. And what we'll find when we look at complicated treaties that have a lot of agreements are that they typically, like the Ramsar Convention and the World Heritage Convention, they typically produce, the Secretariat or the parties will produce a handbook for implementation. It might be a few hundred pages long, but it brings together a lot of the concepts that they've agreed on. So you have a really short treaty, then a much longer implementation manual, and that's been agreed by the parties. But when you understand the basic principles for interpreting the treaties, you see that you can actually refer to those manuals and later agreements. Okay, so there's that handout. Can we, whoops. If you just take out the International Convention, Whaling Convention. So it's only 4 pages. And let's just look at it. I'm not going to do this for every convention, but it's valuable for us to do it because we see all of the elements that pretty well every convention has. So it's just in 4 pages. You see the preamble. The governments whose duly authorised representatives have subscribed hereto, that is, parties that have signed, recognising the interests of the nations of the world in safeguarding for future generations the great natural resources represented by whale stocks, considering the history of whaling has seen overfishing of one area after another and one species of whale after another, to agree that it's essential to protect all species of whales from further overfishing. So that's the preamble or recitals at the beginning of a treaty, and it's basically setting out the problem that the parties are trying to solve and is relevant to then interpreting the treaty. But this treaty was about originally, so this is 1946, it's desiring to establish a system of international regulation for the whale fisheries to ensure proper and effective conservation and development of whale stocks on the basis of principles embodied in this agreement, an early agreement. And then Article 1 says that it includes the schedule and it applies to factory ships and the like. And then Article 2 is definitions. So it defines what a factory ship is, what a land station is, and then whale catcher and contracting government. So it's very common to see a set of definitions in one of the early articles, either Article 1 or Article 2. And then Article 3, the contracting governments agree to establish an International Whaling Commission. So this is, instead of, I'll just read it, Article 3. The contracting governments agree to establish an International Whaling Commission, hereinafter referred to as the Commission, to be composed of one member from each contracting government. Each member shall have one vote and may be accompanied by one or more experts and advisors. The Commission shall elect a chairman, etc. The Commission shall appoint its own secretary, etc. Expenses. So this is the administration of the treaty. So the International Whaling Commission. Effectively, that's what it's talking about as a conference of the parties, because each party has got one vote, and it's different to the Secretariat. The Secretariat basically looks after like booking the venues where the Commission will meet, but it's the parties that have a vote in the International Whaling Commission. And then Article 4, the Commission may either in collaboration with or through independent agencies, etc., encourage studies, etc. Then Article 5, the Commission may amend from time to time the provisions of the schedule by adopting regulations with respect to the conservation and utilisation of wild resources, fixing protected and unprotected species, open and closed seasons, open and closed waters. Okay, so the schedule is really important. And then Article 6, the Commission may from time to time make recommendations to any or all contracting governments on any matter which relate to whales. So recommendations. The contracting government shall ensure the prompt transmission of information regarding whaling. Article 8, notwithstanding anything contained in this convention, any contracting party may grant to any of its nationals a special permit authorising that national to kill, take and treat whales for the purposes of scientific research. I'll come back to Article 8. That's what Japan relied upon for a couple of decades to continue its research whaling. Because what happened in the 80s was the contracting parties agreed to amend the schedules to prohibit commercial whaling. Japan continued to say, even though commercial whaling has been banned, under Article 8 we have a legal right to carry out research. And the fact that they ended up being eaten in Japan was authorised under if you look at the terms of the article, any whales taken under these special permits shall, so as far as practicable, be processed, and the process shall be dealt with in accordance with the directions issued by the government. So you can chop them up and eat them and earn money from them. And as long as it's research, it's authorised under Article 8. And then Article 9, each contracting government shall take appropriate measures to ensure the application of the provisions of this convention and punishment of infractions against the said provisions in operations carried out by persons or vessels under its jurisdiction. So each country basically controls its own whaling fleets. So one of the things with international law is it's binding between countries, but it's not binding on, say, you and me. So you and I aren't bound by this international agreement. It's binding between the parties, which is the government of Australia, the government of Japan, the government of the United States of America, the governments that are parties to it. They are bound by these obligations, and then it's their laws that apply to the people within their countries or vessels registered to them. So that's Article 9. Countries agree to basically impose in their own legal systems and their own citizens and vessels compliance with the convention. Article 10, this convention shall be ratified and instruments of ratification shall be deposited with the government of the United States of America. This is about ratification. This convention shall, when instruments of ratification have been deposited by at least 6 signatory governments, which shall include the governments of the Netherlands, Norway, the USSR, the UK, Northern Ireland and the USA, enter into force with respect to those governments and shall enter into force with respect to each government which subsequently ratifies. So this is the ratification rules, and you can see how it's built in a number of countries that have got to ratify it. And then Article 11, each contracting party may withdraw. So what you've got here are all of the elements of your standard treaty. The preamble, some definitions, creating a body that administers the treaty and meets, and then also implementation within your own country, as well as ratification and withdrawal. And so the schedule, I've just extracted a bit of the schedule, but the bit that I've just got there on the screen on the left, capture, the killing for commercial purposes of whales, except minke whales using the cold grenade harpoon, shall be forbidden from the beginning of the 1980-1981 pelagic and 1981 coastal seasons. The killing for commercial purposes of minke whales, etc. So that is the ban on commercial whaling, and minke's got brought in afterwards. So that's the ban, it's in the schedule, agreed by the parties. So that's an example of a treaty. So, and the schedule is a key to the ban on commercial whaling. So let's just unpack that a bit, because as I say, this convention I really wanted to look at to understand some fundamentals. So let's unpack who's an actor, for instance, in this. So actors and institutions that are relevant to administering a treaty. So there's the common international actors and institution relevant for treaties are the parties to the treaty. So the parties are just the national governments that have signed up to it. So the states or nations. In international discussion, states are used as a word for country. So don't get confused when you look at a country like Australia or the United States of America, which have a federal system of government where there's a national government and then state governments beneath that. So when we talk in Australia about, the states can do this, we generally mean like the government of Queensland can do whatever you're talking about. Because in our system of government, we've got a federal system of government with states. The US has, its own system of federal government, and many countries don't have that. So New Zealand is a unitary system of government. There's no sub level. There's a national government, and then you really go down to local and regional councils. So parties, the conference of the parties, or COPs, or other decision-making bodies for the treaty. So the conference of the parties is in the Whaling Convention. It's called the meeting of the International Whaling Commission. The Secretariat is typically a body that doesn't have voting rights and is really about the administration. So you can think about it, if the Secretariat might book the room where the parties are going to meet to discuss the implementation of the treaty. So they book a big conference room for 2 weeks and they organise the accommodation for the delegates. And then everyone arrives and all the administration is ironed out. The PowerPoint works, the lights turn on, the Secretariat's done all of those things. And maintains the website and that sort of stuff. And non-government organisations or NGOs, they don't have legal powers, but they're often accompanied delegations. So a country might go, and countries like Australia and the US will often take conservation groups along as part of their delegations, so the conservation groups can sort of participate in the negotiations. And then other actors and institutions. So you've got the United Nations, but for something, each treaty effectively is its own little world. We've got the overall system of the United Nations, but like the Whaling Convention, for instance, it's the parties to that convention that are relevant. So say a country like, let's just say Switzerland, pretty sure they're not a party to the Whaling Convention because they don't have any coastline. Ironically, there's a number of parties to the Whaling Convention which have no interest in whaling, that effectively paid to be there. So bribery and paying grants to countries is often being used by the United States, now by China. Different countries will give a grant to often a poor Pacific country. That Pacific country then goes along to a lot of conventions and supports the country that's giving them a lot of money. So Japan has used grants to South Pacific countries that have never whaled, will go along and vote with Japan. So essentially vote buying is quite common. So you've got the United Nations, but the treaties are their own little world within that system, and it's the parties to the treaty that are, relevant to its administration. The Security Council, General Assembly, those sorts of things aren't specifically relevant. The United Nations Environment Programme often plays a facilitation role for a lot of environment programs. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change relative to climate change, World Trade Organization for Trade, International Court of Justice. There's a lot of other international actors. I said 193. Yeah, 193 members of the United Nations, I think, at the moment, unless it's changed in the last few months. Vatican City and Kosovo are recognised but not members. Taiwan, or the Republic of China, is not recognised or a member of the UN since 1971, but it is an independent state. Okay, regional groups can be important. So the obvious example is the European Union, or EU. So that's a group of countries which have come together to form a common framework for governance within their region. There's also the Southern Common Market in South America and ASEAN in Southeast Asia. So the European Union grew from 1957, a small group of countries, grew to being quite large in the last few years, and then obviously we've got Brexit now, with the UK saying it's breaking away, and the disaster that seems to be unfolding for the UK for that. So EU, very important internationally. They often, under the EU system, the countries vote as a bloc, so they have a common foreign policy. But if you've got how many are there? About 30 now. I can't remember the actual number of them. So each one of them has their own vote in, say, the International Convention, the Climate Change Convention. So they've got like a block of 20 or 30 votes, and they vote together. Mercosur, the Southern Common Market, is an economic and political agreement between Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Venezuela. Bolivia joined in 2012, so it's promoting free trade in South America. And then ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, including China as an observer. So there's a number of parties or voting blocks that are also important to understand. The most important is the G77 and China. So it originally had 77 members when it was founded in 1964. It's grown now to over 130 members, but it's still called the G77. So they don't just keep upping the number, so it's now the G129, and then next year it's the G132. It's the G77, but what that means is developing countries, they generally coordinate to have common negotiating positions. So if you think about it, 193 votes in the UN, or essentially any international treaty, that's the maximum number of votes you can have. The G77 in China has the majority. A lot of systems, though, operate by any one country can stop or stymie a vote. So simply having essentially the majority doesn't necessarily give you the ability to just continue to make decisions that even one country doesn't agree with, but it gives you a lot of negotiating power, because if you're the bulk of countries who've all agreed on something, then countries are reluctant to be the odd one out. So the G77 in China, within that there's some subgroups. So the African group, a group of all African countries. The Alliance of Small Island States, or AOSIS, is a coalition of 43 low-lying and small island countries, most of which are members of G77, and they're particularly vulnerable to sea level rise. They've been particularly active in climate change negotiations. And then the least developed countries, or LDC group. So this is the 50 countries that are essentially the poorest. and they often get special assistance in treaty negotiations. The EU, 27 members, the Umbrella Group, a loose coalition, the Environmental Integrity Group. So you get the idea? So voting blocks can be really important. So yeah, here's the G77 in terms of the geographic spread. Now, in terms of the IWC, there's basically two blocks, anti-whaling and pro-whaling. Pretty basic. So anti-whaling countries that oppose whaling, other than indigenous whaling, so allowing, say, Inuit people to go and kill whales for their subsistence farming. Pretty well everyone agrees that that's acceptable. So the USA, Australia, UK, etc. The pro-whaling bloc is Japan, Russia, etc. And yeah, as I mentioned before, votes for sale. Japan has actively bought the votes in support of numerous countries over past decades through foreign aid payments. By soliciting allies, basically Japan's amassed a pro-whaling vote. Even some landlocked countries such as Mongolia have joined the IWC. They're landlocked, no interest in whaling or whatever, and they vote in the IWC. So it's a bit weird, but that's just the reality of it. And I'm also not singling out Japan, it's just we're talking about whaling at the moment, and that's the reality of what Japan's done. The US clearly has used foreign aid to pressure African states to vote on their behalf. In the Cold War, the US and the USSR used aid and basically military support to bolster themselves in all sorts of different fora. So, and China particularly now is using foreign aid and grants to effectively get votes in international fora.
Sorry, what happens if someone knows that a country paid to other countries in order to vote for one bloc or another bloc? What happens?
So great question. What happens if one country knows that another country has been paid to vote on its behalf? Basically nothing.
Okay.
Yep. There's no because countries have sovereignty, they can decide for themselves how they want to vote. You can't stop them. You can't stop those payments being made, even openly. Like it's a part of the system that effectively can't be. Yeah. So at the same time, the countries don't flout it. Japan doesn't go out and say, "Oh, we've bought 20 votes. Here they are. Everyone line up." It's there's a lot of. They don't want to be called out for that. They want to be seen as, all these small countries have voluntarily come along and voted on their behalf, because from a public relations perspective, you don't want to be seen to have bought, all of these votes. But yeah, plenty of, investigative journalism on exactly that sort of stuff. Okay, so Japan increases her aid when countries vote with the voting bloc in the IWC. By contrast, the UK, US and France do not appear to reward voting for their bloc, but punish voting against their bloc. So this is from an article in the Journal of Public Economics from 2015. So, okay, so a couple of years ago, Australia took the remarkable step of taking Japan to the International Court of Justice. It was remarkable because countries very rarely sue each other. And it was unusual because Australia and Japan are relatively few countries have accepted the jurisdiction of the ICJ. Australia and Japan have, but the big countries like the USA, Russia don't. Why do you think that's the case? Why would a country like Australia and Japan, countries like Australia and Japan, accept an international court to rule on disputes between them, but not, say, a country like the US or China?
So we're small enough to be more vulnerable than those large countries.
Great, yeah, it's basically about vulnerability. Everything up to a small power, to a middle power, basically signs up to every international institution it can pretty well, because you get protection from these international frameworks. But countries like the USA, Russia and China are big and ugly enough with big military powers. They don't want to be told by the ICJ what they can and can't do. So they refuse to accept the jurisdiction of the ICJ. Small and middle powers, Australia calls itself a middle power. very small military, very small population, relatively small economically. We call ourselves a middle power, and so we have accepted the jurisdiction of the ICJ, but the USA, Russia haven't, China. Okay, so this is a beautiful building that houses the ICJ, the Peace Palace in The Hague in the Netherlands. This is the court actually hearing the case, so lawyers appearing before, actually this is not that case, this is 2006, but the judges, this is actually the hearing in 2013 with the lawyers for both Australia and Japan appearing before I think it's 13 members of the ICJ. You can see a beautiful building. This is the legal team for Australia. I had a solicitor who was part of that team, gave me pictures. She gave a seminar for a course I gave a few years ago and gave me some pictures from their team. So this is them working away, preparing for the legal case. So Australia spent about $20 million on the case. And it centred around the interpretation of Article 8, which I mentioned before. So basically the ability to undertake research. And I won't play the footage, but essentially the ICJ agreed with Australia. I was amazed. I thought Japan had a really strong argument under Article 8. But the ICJ decided that what Japan was doing exceeded what could be characterised as research, as legitimate research. And so essentially, this is part of it. When reviewing the grant of special permit authorising the killing, the court will assess first the program, whether it involves scientific research, and then is its implementation reasonable for achieving those objectives? And then they went on, paragraph 227, taken as a whole, the court considers that the Japanese research program involves activities that can be broadly characterised as scientific research, but the evidence does not establish the program's design and implementation are reasonable in relation to achieving its stated objectives. So what Japan did after losing in this court case was go and redesign the program, have a smaller number of whales, and they're continuing to whale, but under a different program. So that's how they sort of got around it. So yeah, this is part of the judgment. So Australia's formal request, it won on a number of things. So this is one of the slides that Anne gave me, the solicitor. It won on the court having jurisdiction, etc. Japan was in breach. It didn't win on everything. In response, Japan came up with a new scientific whale research program in the Antarctic on UREP-A to replace the previous programs, and it reduced the number of whales from about 900 that it was killing to about 300 compared with the, Okay, this is probably an obvious question, but do politics play a role in international law? What do you guys think? What are the politics in whaling? Like, why does Australia oppose Japan whaling? Why do we care? Let's just say they're only killing minkies. There's over 500,000 minkies, and they're taking 300 a year. No way it's going to cause them to go extinct. They're only taking minkies. They're not taking blue whales. They're taking what would have to be a sustainable take of minkies. Why do we care?
Public opinion.
Bingo. Public opinion where?
In Australia.
In Australia. Whales are really popular. They send up these, PR reps come up the coast every year. There's thousands of them. Everyone goes over to Australia or wherever, and you look at this whale going by doing jumps and flicking its tail. It's fantastic PR. If you were a species designing a PR program, you would base it around the whales and humpbacks. Be charismatic, be good looking, and don't eat humans. If they ate humans, there's no program about conserving great white sharks, even though they're amazing creatures, because they tend to eat people, which is really bad for your PR. Whales don't eat people. Occasionally an orca has had a nibble, but generally whales don't eat people. So Australians love them, and it's the reason why the Australian government opposes whaling. even though Japan is one of our biggest trading partners. So we have this fight each year with Japan. You know, it's one of our biggest trading partners. And it's because of domestic political pressure. So the converse of that, why does Japan whale? Why do they take 300 whales when they get all of this, you know, international condemnation from, you know, its big, you know, some of its biggest trading partners?
Isn't it said for the reasons of culture and science?
Often said to be culture, yeah. Japan used to undertake some whaling in its coastal waters. It was really only the 50s and 60s though. After World War II, McArthur, I understand, was basically instituted industrial scale whaling. It was to, you know, stop Japan from, the Japanese population from starving, and that's when they used large scale whaling. But so it's, as I understand it, it's a relatively recent component of, you know, the large scale use of whaling. So there is the cultural component. But why go down all the way down to Antarctica and have this big fight? Why not just take a few whales in your coastal waters, you know?
I feel like I've heard it's because they want to show that they can, that no one can stop them.
Yeah, my view, not being Japanese, but my view of it has been, it's basically, just as in Australia there's this public pressure to stop whaling, in Japan, particularly as I understand, there's several prefectures where there's, like the whaling industries are centred, and they're disproportionately politically important in the Japanese system of government. So those pro-whaling prefectures really drive the national government to continue to oppose it, and you'd suspect it's also not wanting to be told what to do by other countries. So, but it's domestic politics that, you know, they don't need 300 whales a year to feed themselves. It's not a question of feeding them. You know, it's not a question of needing to. You can talk about the cultural aspects of it. Yeah, your thoughts? I'm sure you can jump right in.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of it's kind of interesting because one part of whaling in Japan that I think is often overlooked, which is the tourism aspect.
Yep.
A lot of people who travel within Japan, like internationally into Japan, like to try whales. And there's lots of conventions and tourism events that center around whaling because it's such like a controversial topic.
Yep. Sorry, I was just extending my recording time. So tourism is, okay, within Japan?
Yeah, so there's prefectures that are big on whaling. Japan's very big on like traveling to prefectures with the like intention of doing like that prefectures thing, and whaling is that for prefectures, and so it kind of sustains a lot of the tourism economies to have whales available to use.
Okay. I don't mean to, you know, I don't pretend, never been to Japan. Japanese culture is very complicated. The point I would make, though, with this is when you think about why countries take on particular positions, it's typically a domestic audience that they're playing to. So it's not necessarily logically, their interests as countries are not necessarily why they take on a position internationally. Playing to the domestic audience is often a really, really important component of what happens internationally. So, do politics play a role in international law? Yes, absolutely. It's just like staring you in the face. It is so fundamental and important that if you just try and read the text of a convention and then look at what countries are doing from a logical perspective, you'll be completely confused. Politics has an incredible role, and domestic politics. Okay, so in that context, yes?
So you just mentioned some bigger countries like US and China.
Yep.
They don't follow, and they don't at least ICJ.
Yep,
so,
the International Court of Justice, yes.
Yeah, so how do these politics have power over those bigger countries?
So great question. So for the large countries, how do they, you know, who can tell them what to do? Very difficult, and often you can't. So unless they want to go to war, and typically they don't want to. And often there can just be standoffs on particular issues, like Japan and China are at a standoff over the Senkaku Islands, and there's no easy way to resolve it. So China refuses to submit its claims to the South China Sea to any outside body. It just says we have a right to this entire area, even though it looks completely inconsistent with every principle of international maritime law, what they're claiming, just as we'll look at that in terms of UNCLOS tomorrow. They will never submit their claims to an international body, because if you applied normal international law, they would lose. But because they're so big and powerful and emerging, obviously there's a very important domestic political debate happening within China and the emergence of China and how it sees itself, that this is the century for China to emerge as a global superpower. This is China's century. There's a strong nationalism driving, and now it's pushing out and testing international forum. It's got the One Belt One Road program for putting a road and rail lines across to join with Europe, and it's hugely ambitious, its program, and it's emerging. So very difficult to control those. Just as the US with dropping, using drones to kill people in places like Pakistan. Very difficult for Pakistan to stop it because the US military is so dominant. Okay, sovereignty, I've already mentioned many times, but countries can control within their borders. And we'll talk about maritime areas tomorrow more in terms of UNCLOS, but you've already seen that map with Australia with the maritime areas around it. So normally countries can control out to 200 nautical miles. And then beyond that, it's called the high seas. And countries in those areas, outside of 200 nautical miles, countries essentially can only regulate their own vessels or their own citizens. You can't regulate other vessels or vessels registered in other countries. So the high seas becomes a very, very difficult area to control. So in Antarctica, as mentioned before about the Antarctic system, so there is and I'm going to go on to this in the next lecture, the Antarctic Treaty system, agreed in 1959, and a series of conventions underneath it. Australia has passed laws under our national laws creating a whale sanctuary, making it unlawful to kill whales anywhere within our EEZ. So, as I said, I was involved in a court case. So there was a court case in the ICJ. Before that, there was this case that I acted as a barrister in, where we went to the Federal Court of Australia in Sydney and sued the company. So see this ship, it's not owned by the government of Japan, it's owned by a company called Senkaku Islands, I forget it now. Kyoto Senkaku Islands was a company incorporated in Japan. It actually owned the ships and employed the crews that went to do the whaling under the permit from the government of Japan. So we were acting for a group called the Humane Society International. We sued that company in the Federal Court of Australia, and with a range of hiccups, we eventually got an order from our court saying what they're doing is unlawful and they should be restrained from doing it. Japan has ignored that and they continue to whale. We're not sure if, because this was in 2008 and it was just the time when Kevin Rudd was coming into power, and Rudd and Peter Garrett was his environment spokesperson before they got elected. This case was really hot at the time, and they said if they were elected, they would enforce Australian law stopping whaling. When they got elected, like a lot of things with Rudd, he didn't follow through, and so they never enforced Australian law. But we think that maybe our case contributed to then Rudd deciding to take Japan to the International Court of Justice. So even though we didn't stop any whales being killed directly, we might have led on to the later case. So that was,
So were there any fines or ready to accompany?
Yeah, since then there's been contempt proceedings, there's been an order for $1 million, several $1 million, it's over $1 million that the company will pay. And basically, if a Japanese vessel ever comes into a port in Australia, the Humane Society International can seek to seize it, but because they're out on the high seas and our government refuses to go and arrest them, there's no real practical way to enforce it. So they're operating in breach of the orders.
So did those penalties get paid?
No, not yet, but hey, things can work slowly. If a ship comes in, occasionally they've come in with, a sick sailor or something like that. But when there was a sick sailor who had appendicitis or something, they sailed up to Hobart, and then they picked the sailor up by helicopter, so that they didn't actually come into port, because under our national laws, it's unlawful for a whaling vessel to come into port. So they could have been arrested at that point, so I doubt they will ever come into port, but we're sitting waiting. Okay, just to wrap up, lecture outline, looked at the UN Charter, looked at Whaling Convention. It's really about understanding fundamental points like sovereignty, how a treaty is created, the components. So take-home points, there's two principal sources of international environmental law, treaties and custom. There is a typical process by which treaties are negotiated, agreed, ratified, enter into force and administered by the Conference of the Parties. The main principle for interpreting treaties is to interpret the parts of the treaty relevant to your problem in good faith, in accordance with their ordinary meanings. Politics play an important role, and there can be a complex interplay between international and national laws. So they're the take-home points. If you are really interested in whaling, you might think about it as a research paper. You don't need to if you're not really interested in whaling. There's a whole heap of extra reading there if you'd like. The ICJ case, the UN website, the International Whaling Commission website, if you want to. But I don't, I just put them up there as a list. I really just want you to, more important for our purposes, what I've given you in handouts, so understanding the basics about how a treaty is created.